Also, the research suggests that the alienated children's hostility towards their parent is usually temporary, usually tends to resolve itself within 1 to 2 years without any sort of intervention.
False. Okay, false. So false. Actually, if this extends into adulthood, it's very rare for kids to figure it out and to reunite with their rejected parent. Very rare.
But here's the issue, though. Although false allegations during custody battles are very rare, alienation.
Oh my God. Hi, and welcome back to the Anti-Alienation Project. My name is Maddie, and here I talk about all things related to a certain form of child psychological abuse that I went through for 20 years, commonly referred to as parental alienation. Now, this really involves an angry, spiteful parent, often in the context of a custody dispute or a divorce, who manipulates their child to reject their other parent. And it causes a lot of long-lasting, severe damage to the child. And that's why I speak out about it here on my project. So a few months ago, some people started sending me this video that was done by a psychologist named Dr. Anna. It's called Psychology with Dr. Anna. And she says, I'm a psychology educator and fiction author with a doctorate in clinical psychology. The video we're going to be looking at today is called I Went Down a Dark Rabbit Hole About Parental Alienation. And it has 150,000 views. So right off the bat, if you could just help me out and like the video, share the video, comment on the video to help boost it in the algorithm, that would help me out so much because I want to get this video to have 150,000 views. So we're going to explore this video. It's quite long. I was hesitant to cover this video because I'm not sure her approach on it. I haven't watched the video yet, but it's important to cover the different nuances, I think, regarding this topic. Certainly, there are people who exploit this term, people who exploit this form of abuse, just like there are other people who exploit sexual abuse, for example, people who claim they were sexually assaulted when they really were not. The same thing can happen with any type of harm. The same thing can happen with any type of abuse. So without further ado, let's just break down this video. And it's important to note that I'm not coming from the doctor's perspective or the therapist's perspective. I don't study this. I lived it. I was manipulated to reject my dad for 20 years, made to believe lies, false allegations, etc., which damaged our relationship, damaged my self-esteem, and much, much more. So I'm coming from it from the point of view of a child who really lived through this abuse. And my view is that exploiters can exploit anything. I don't care what you call it, but the psychological child abuse I went through is absolutely real and can already be diagnosed as such.
Anytime I talk about parent-child estrangement online, there's always someone in the comments saying, well, what about parental alienation? That's very real. Suggesting that a lot of parents are estranged from their children because the other child's parent brainwashed them. So I decided to look at the scientific literature on this. And right off the bat, my original inkling was this. Yes, there absolutely exist parents who triangulate and isolate their children from the other parent. Usually these parents are abusive and often they have some type of cluster B personality disorder like narcissism. However, I strongly suspected that a lot of the people crying parental alienation might be the abusers themselves, who cannot accept that their child wants nothing to do with them because of their own behavior, not because anyone is brainwashing them. So I took.
Okay, right off the bat, I tend to agree with her, actually. Surprisingly, I thought I would disagree with this video wholeheartedly, but she acknowledges that this child abuse does exist, that is often related to cluster B personality disorders. True. Like narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. She goes on to say, but on the same token, some people claim that their child is being manipulated when they're really not. And that is also true. My initial reaction is that she does seem to be taking a more nuanced approach to this, which is often the right approach to take, especially with parental alienation, because if you say, everybody who claims that their child is being manipulated is telling the truth, that's not accurate. And if you claim that parental alienation, the true abuse I experienced, doesn't exist, that's also very inaccurate. So I appreciate that she seems to be taking a nuanced approach, but maybe that changes. I don't know. Let's keep watching.
Took a look at the research, and you guys, this is so much worse than I could have expected. I went down a really dark rabbit hole, and apparently, from its very inception, the term parental alienation has been used to discredit the victims of abuse. This is going to be a really heavy topic, so buckle in and let's get started.
I wonder if the darkness she's talking about has to do with Richard Gardner.
The term parental alienation was first coined by Richard Gardner, a
Okay. Now, I want to say something before she even gets started on Richard Gardner, and I want to compare it to the term gender dysphoria. Now, I know that transgender topics are much more talked about and known in society right now. And I also know that the term gender dysphoria, when you feel extremely uneasy and uncomfortable in your own gender that you're born into, is a term that was coined by a doctor named Dr. John Money. And Dr. John Money was a sick, twisted, deranged individual. He also did the first sex change on a twin boy, and it ended up horribly. Both of those twins ended up unaliving themselves. But Dr. John Money actually sexually abused both of his child subjects that were in the sex change surgery. And he was a vile, vile man. Not only did he believe in pedophilia, but he actually acted it out on two innocent little boys who should have been able to trust their doctor. And the reason why I'm drawing the parallel between gender dysphoria and Dr. Money is because just because Dr. John Money coined the term gender dysphoria, nobody is up in arms wanting to get rid of the term gender dysphoria or claiming that gender dysphoria doesn't exist. Although, if you go down that rabbit hole, which a lot of people on YouTube have, there are videos out there you can watch. If you Google Dr. John Money, nobody is against the fact that gender dysphoria exists just because the term itself was coined by a really sick, twisted individual. Make it make sense. Make it make sense. So I wanted just to offer that. I wanted to offer that take because just because somebody who coins a certain term or makes a certain scientific discovery is someone that we don't want to look up to in society, that doesn't make the scientific discovery or the term any less credible.
Psychiatrist loosely affiliated with Columbia Medical School who ran a clinical practice for divorcing parents. And by loosely affiliated, I mean he was an unpaid volunteer at Columbia, not that he was an actual professor there. Richard Gardner himself was divorced with 3 kids, which is a big shocker. And here's the general gist of his parental alienation syndrome theory. Based solely on his interpretation of data gathered from his clinical practice, Gardner posited that CSA allegations were rampant in custody litigation, and that 90% of children in custody litigation suffered from a disorder which he called parental alienation syndrome. He described PAS as a syndrome whereby vengeful mothers employed CSA allegations as a powerful weapon to punish ex-husbands and ensure custody to themselves.
I want to point out that she's quoting a study by Joan Meir, 2013. This study has been debunked. Also, Joan Meir has connections to a lot of DV advocacy groups that claim not only the parental alienation term is harmful, but that this child psychological abuse doesn't exist at all. Call it what you want, but she claims it doesn't exist whatsoever. And there's a lot of money in this field. I wanted to say a little bit more about the research done by Joan Meir. It's actually pronounced Meir. So this is from the National Parents Organization, or otherwise known as the NPO, which is a nonprofit that focuses on promoting shared parenting. And they point out that Joan Meir actually received a grant of more than $500,000 from the National Institute of Justice in order to promote that parental alienation is pseudoscience. So they also, you can check out on the website of the NPO more problems with the research, but they quote that they began the research with a flawed assumption, and the research was designed from the outset to come to the preconceived results that this abuse is not real. So that's problematic because I know, and I'm not even a scientist, but I know that when you start a research project, you should come without your biases. Karen Woodall, another figure in this space, also pointed out findings from the Meir study, which is that basically child abuse allegations and alienation defenses put mothers at the high risk of losing custody, reduces the likelihood of abuse being believed, etc. Meir's study was also replicated by 2 other researchers, and they asked Meir to provide them with appendices and statistical output to evaluate her conclusions, and she refused to provide them. She questioned them about who they worked for, who they represented, whether they represented mothers and fathers, and she refused to provide the necessary information. Another bit of information I think it's important to know is that Joan Meir is so proud to have finally coined a new term to capture the experience of mothers whose child-parent relationships are undermined by abusive exes, aka she wants to re-term parental alienation as CAMS, child and maternal sabotage, to effectively eliminate the possibility that a mother would manipulate or could manipulate their child to reject their father. Not only does this expose her true agenda, in my opinion, of just being for women's rights and to think that mothers are above fathers, in my opinion, it's also a slap in the face. I was manipulated to reject my dad for 20 years. So according to her, my experience, I guess, doesn't happen. This is not a gendered issue, and I get so frustrated when I see people like Joan Meir making it a gendered issue. Anyone with a pulse can alienate, and she is discrediting the experience of millions of parents of children worldwide by advocating for this new term. It also exposes her true motive, in my opinion. I could do a whole other video on Joan Meir, and perhaps I should, but I just wanted to point that out. Another thing is that I actually disagree with the construct of parental alienation syndrome. It's not a syndrome at all. It is a type of child psychological abuse that can already be diagnosed with a couple different diagnoses actually in the current DSM, like a shared persecutory delusion or child psychological abuse. It's already diagnosable. We don't need to add it to the DSM, and it certainly is not a syndrome. A syndrome is a cluster of symptoms that do not have an identifiable cause. Okay? This abuse has an identifiable cause, the abusive parent. End of story, period. So I don't agree with the construct of it as a syndrome whatsoever. I also don't agree with Joan Meir here, who claims that this abuse doesn't exist at all.
He further theorized that such mothers enlisted the children in their campaign of denigration and vilification of the father, that they often brainwashed or programmed the children into believing untrue claims of abuse by the father, and that the children then fabricated and contributed their own stories. So Richard Gardner developed his parental alienation theory based not on research, just on his own personal biases against women and his clinical experiences. He estimated a false reporting rate of mothers.
I think it's a little unfair, though, to claim that Dr. Gardner had a bias against women. Maybe he really did observe a lot of women in family court doing this to their children. That doesn't inherently prove that he had a bias against women.
At 90%, whereas the US Department of Justice estimates the actual rate to be less than 2%. His assessments focused on the personality characteristics of the people involved rather than an actual assessment of abuse. And he created something called the Sexual Abuse Legitimacy Scale. Which was so criticized by scientific experts as garbage that he was forced to withdraw it. Parental alienation syndrome has not been recognized by the American Psychiatric Association or any other medical or professional association. Attempts to include the syndrome in the DSM have been swiftly rebuffed. The American Bar Association...
Rightly so. I don't want it in the DSM either, and I'm somebody who went through this as a child for 20 years. I don't want it in the DSM.
Association concluded that it's a junk science without scientific merit, and as the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges stated, it diverts attention away from the behaviors of the abusive parent who may have directly influenced the children's responses by acting in violent, disrespectful, intimidating, humiliating, and or discrediting ways toward the children themselves or towards the children's other parent. In addition to his theory being largely considered pseudoscience, Richard Gardner had some very concerning views on, I gotta be careful what I say or this is gonna get demonetized. I'll put it on screen, and from here on forth, I'm going to refer to it as CA. He was an advocate against mandated reporting, that law that adults in certain fields have to report suspicions of CA, and he was also against immunity for those reporting suspicions of abuse.
Again, this is just an ad hominem attack. Yes, he had problematic views, maybe even sick views. Does that take away from the reality of the abuse that many children are experiencing worldwide every day? No, it's just one man. That's why I made the parallel at the beginning of the video with Dr. Money and gender dysphoria. Does the actions of one sick, twisted individual named Dr. John Money take away from the suffering of millions of people across the world with gender dysphoria? No.
His remedy for severe parental alienation syndrome was to completely deny the mother contact with her child and to deprogram the child from believing they were abused. And after being...
Okay, I didn't know that part, but actually I agree with that. This is child psychological abuse. I don't know how many times I have to say this in the video, but they need a protective separation. Okay. You will already see that advocated from a lot of other people like Dr. Childress, like Dorsey Pruder. They need a protective separation from the abusive parent in the same way that a child suffering from SA or physical harm would need a protective separation from the parent. If a parent will not stop hurting their child, the child needs a protective separation. How is that controversial? Psychological abuse, you might not be able to see the scars or the bruises or the blood, but you can absolutely test for it, and it leaves just the same lifelong devastation on the child's psyche.
Subjected to this protocol, some of the children who were forced to then reunite with their rejected parent then unfortunately went on to end their lives. He asserted in a filmed interview that a child who tells his mother he has been blanked by his or her father should be told, "I don't believe you. I'm going to beat you for saying it. Don't you ever talk that way again about your father." He was also accused of expressing sympathy towards people who are, attracted to, What he said is honestly too disgusting for me to even say without getting demonetized, but suffice it to say that Gardner thought CSA is just not so bad for kids, and it shouldn't be vilified in the way that it is.
I think anyone with a halfway decent, healthy mind would say, whoa, 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 whoa. Disgusting. Disgusting. But again, one man and one man's problematic views on CSA does not discredit the reality of the fact that this child psychological abuse exists, is perpetuated day after day for millions of children worldwide. I feel like I am just repeating myself here because of one man's views on sexuality that are very problematic. That does not discredit the painful experiences of so many people, families.
He thought that the majority of CSA claims were the product of parental alienation syndrome rather than actual experiences of CSA.
It's important to mention here that yes, CSA absolutely exists, is devastating, horrible. It's also important to mention that so do false allegations of CSA. So do false allegations of CSA. And one of the key tactics that abusive parents use in order to turn their children against their other parent is to use false allegations of abuse or CSA, have the child believe them, and get the child to do the rejecting themselves. Textbook. It's textbook. And I don't know, let's check to see when this video was actually created. So this video was made 7 months ago. Wow, that's surprising. I would have guessed that this video was made during the Me Too movement because there was a whole movement where people were encouraged to believe all allegations of sexual abuse face value without question. And I'm sorry, but it's not always the case. I think a lot of folks want to believe that people would not make up such a heinous allegation. people wouldn't fabricate lies like that, especially to their child. Think again. Think again. That's why we have forensic evaluators to determine if CSA truly took place. It's important, yes, to validate the child's experience, their pain. It's important to validate the child's pain, their suffering. And with the particular family dynamic we're talking about today, it's equally as important to dig deeper and to find the evidence to prove that it actually happened, because false allegations are so rampant with the abusive parent trying to manipulate their child. I hope I'm making sense.
Now, Richard Gardner ended his life at age 72, though I think you'll agree that the legacy he left behind is one that continues to harm thousands upon thousands of victims today. Now that the pseudoscientific parental alienation syndrome theory has infested the courts, child protective services, and the media with headlines such as this: anytime a child has hostile feelings towards one of their parents, the abusive parent can call it parental alienation to their advantage to get more access to that child.
That's not true. First of all, it's extremely unnatural for a child to reject a parent. Even in situations of true abuse and neglect, it is very rare and unnatural for a child to reject their parent. There have been studies done on this. When CPS goes to take a child from an unsafe home, the child usually protects the abusive parent. They don't want to leave the home with the abusive parent. Very unnatural to reject a parent. And there have been procedures and different ways to identify psychologically abused children from children who are actually going through abuse.
It's a diversion strategy meant to distract from the actual question at hand, which is, did abuse occur? Experts recommend that any sort of alienation claims must be set aside until or unless abuse is first ruled out. Trying to consider both simultaneously can be very dangerous. According to Meir, there's only one empirical study that has tried to...
Yeah, Meir's not a credible source. Meir's not a credible source here. So according to Meir, I'm not going to take anything she says after that seriously.
To look at the actual soundness of parental alienation syndrome, and even then it was just to find the inter-rater reliability of PAS built directly on Gardner's criteria. And actually, many therapists who were given these criteria refused to participate in the study, citing concerns that his criteria reflect untrue assumptions. There is no empirical research validating the existence of parental alienation syndrome, only extensive empirical proof that the assumptions underlying the theory are false, Meir says. Where PAS presumes that protective mothers are vengeful and pathologically program their children, it is not women and children, but non-custodial fathers who are most likely to fabricate child maltreatment claims.
First of all, I would like a source from this lady on why Meir is credible at all to quote. Second, I would like a source on where this statement comes from and why she claims it's not women and children, but non-custodial fathers who are most likely to fabricate child maltreatment claims. Where is that coming from? Like, what study is that coming from? Yeah, this is I'm afraid that this Dr. Anna, while at first I was hopeful that this video would be more nuanced and fair, I think that she has been taken with the DV stance that this abuse doesn't exist, that fathers don't deserve to be in their children's lives, that 50-50 custody is bad, and that mothers should always have full custody. They literally believe that moms are better parents than dads. And I wonder how much research she did into this Joan Meir.
Only 14% of false allegations are made by custodial parents, which is typically the mother. The vast majority of them are fabricated by the parent who doesn't have custody for probably very obvious reasons why they don't.
Source, please. Source, please. I would like a source. That would be great. Thank you.
And the parental alienation syndrome theory is very circular. If a parent makes an effort in court to corroborate their allegations, this is seen as further proof of parental alienation syndrome, so they can't win. And if they find a therapist to agree with them and corroborate them, the therapist is also accused of participating in the dysfunction of parental alienation syndrome.
That's why you evaluate the child for signs of child psychological abuse. Because if they are, quote unquote, alienated, they will show signs of child psychological abuse. And the relationship with their psychologically abusive parent, you should be a trained professional should be able to pick up on that.
In more recent times, there's been a shift from calling it parental alienation syndrome to simply calling it parental alienation or the alienated child. Less about the alienating parent and more about a child who just doesn't feel connected to one of their parents in the midst of a divorce. And some of the predictors for
that's not what I would characterize an alienated child as either. You don't just feel disconnected from your parent. You're made to believe lies about your parent. You're made to believe your parent is selfish, narcissistic, missing part of their soul, is crazy, has abandoned you, doesn't love you. Really, really damaging things to make a child believe about their parent who actually does love them. Okay? You don't feel disconnected. I just don't like the way she's coming about this. I don't like the way she's coming about it. There's so many other things she could have done to educate herself before making this video, rather than just read one article from Joan Meir, who, by the way, is connected to Tina Swift in One Mom's Battle and passing laws that prevent reunification therapy, which is the only current therapy that exists for children who've gone through this.
This include role reversal with an emotionally needy parent, when a child feels like they need to be the one taking care of their parent who's emotionally immature. Lack of warm, involved parenting by the rejected parent, or critical incidents of CA. And these more modern approaches to parental alienation say that the goal should be a more realistic and healthy relationship with both parents rather than just reconciliation with the rejected parent. However, parental alienation as it's used today is still virtually identical to Gardner's original criteria for parental alienation syndrome, and most often without any sort of acknowledgement of its incredibly problematic origins. And the little research that is done on parental alienation from this more modern approach shows that actual alienation of a child is actually quite rare, even.
This is starting to piss me off. The only quote, the only person, the only body of work, the only experience she's quoting is Joan Meir, who doesn't believe it's real. So we need a little bit more evidence to balance the scales here, lady. Oh, this frustrates me to no end. Let me take a deep breath. First of all, to manipulate a child to reject their parent, it's not rare. I would go as far as to say it's actually pretty common, especially in the context of a custody dispute or a divorce where parents are angry, emotions are high, fear of losing your children is high.
When parents make very derogatory statements about the other parent, and when children are estranged from a parent, there are always multiple reasons, some of which include that parent's own conduct.
Not always. Not always. If you are systematically controlling your child's mind to believe terrible, negative things about their other parent, they will become, quote unquote, estranged due to the abusive parent's behavior. How is that not easy to comprehend?
Also, the research suggests that the alienated children's hostility towards their parent is usually temporary, usually tends to resolve itself within 1 to 2 years without any sort of intervention.
False. Okay, false. So false. False, false, false. Wow, very false. No, Dr. Anna, no. Actually, if this extends into adulthood, it's very rare for kids to figure it out and to reunite with their rejected parent. Very rare. And she quotes the research as if Joan Meir is the end all be all on child psychological abuse research. Oh my God, this video is getting worse and worse. Guys, are you getting frustrated too? Is this just me, or is this infuriating? Just infuriating. And how about the fact that she's not even talking about the child's experience? Okay. I've interviewed dozens of people who have been manipulated to reject their parent and then gone on to adulthood. At some point in their adulthood, they realize what happened. I've interviewed dozens of people with this exact experience, like me. And all of them across the board have said that the term parental alienation, it was like a light bulb moment. They were able to realize what had happened to them. So there is a little bit of utility in that term, because while the term parental alienation resonates with the children who've been through it, it's like, oh my God, that's what happened. I was turned against my other parent. It can often take months or even years after having that light bulb moment to admit that you've been through abuse. That's more hard. That's more tricky to admit that you've been through abuse. It's easier to recognize what you've been through with this terminology. So even if that's the only utility to it, I want to bring that up because it can actually wake some adults up to the fact that they've gone through this.
Lots of kids have resentment towards one or both of their parents when their family is breaking up, and that is to some extent normal. It also shows that children are resilient. They're unlikely to be swayed to hate one of their parents unless the other parent is actively coercing or terrorizing them into doing so. And
children are resilient? Are you effing kidding me? Yeah. Okay. The people I've interviewed, the children who are manipulated, and myself included, have all been intelligent individuals, perceptive individuals who had a very close relationship with the parent they were manipulated to reject. And this abuse is just like any other abuse, lady. It's just as damaging as any other type of abuse. Or are you going to tell a CSA victim, children are resilient, you'll get through it 1 to 2 years, you'll be okay? No, you would validate their experience. You would give them every resource and opportunity to heal. You would provide them with support. You would recognize their pain. You wouldn't just say children are resilient. I'm starting to get really angry. She's a doofus. She's a doofus.
In which case you have bigger fish to fry in terms of that family than just the parental alienation. But here's the issue though. Although false allegations during custody battles are very rare, alienation...
Oh my God. If you are a parent, okay, who's had a false allegation made against you, leave in the comments right now. Just write the word, I was falsely accused. Just write that. I want to see how many people are falsely accused. Also, if you're a child who's been through it and you were made to believe false allegations, I want you to write, please write, I believed false allegations, okay? Because she's so wrong. She is so freaking wrong on this point. It's unbelievable. Okay, I'm starting to believe that she has actually been like commissioned to make this video from Joan Meir. Like, I'm starting to believe that this is not her own opinion and she's done little to no research before making this video. Incredibly dangerous because this has 150,000 views, like I said at the beginning of the video. And Dr. Anna, sorry, but your credibility is like gone to me. I don't think you're a credible source of information.
Is a common strategy used by abusers. Triangulation is a common manipulation strategy, for instance, where someone will try to get closer to one person and try to push that person further from another person. Abusers also really strongly rely on isolating their victim so that that person doesn't have anyone to turn to but themselves.
Which are all characteristics of child psychological abuse related to this dynamic. Oh my gosh. Okay, finally. Oh my God. She's quoting Meir again.
And studies show that men who alienate their child from the mom are more likely to have perpetrated DV. Why is this? Because abusers are expert manipulators. They will take any chance to hurt the victim, even if it means weaponizing their children for that purpose. And so some people have proposed maybe DV by proxy would be a better term than parental alienation.
Yeah, that's great. No. DV by proxy? Are you effing kidding me? So you're going to acknowledge that the parent is going through abuse and completely ignore the child's abuse and suffering. Are you effing out of your mind? DV by proxy? Oh, by the way, by proxy. So that's because they weaponize the child. So you're going to actually make the child the perpetrator in that sense with that term. Forget about it, lady. Forget about it. I would highly encourage people to downvote this video. This is not a good video.
Because that's what it really is. It's not so much about getting closer to the child as it is about hurting the other parent.
How do you know? How can you say that with such authority? How do you know? Did you go through this? How do you know? How do you know that? How could you know that? I don't even think she's right on that point, by the way. Hurting the other parent is absolutely a motive for perpetrating this abuse, but equally as important is isolating the child, being able to control that child completely.
Either way, one thing is for sure. I personally would never use the term parental alienation, given its connotations and origins. And to me, when somebody
So then if that's okay, if that is true for you, then you also should not use the term gender dysphoria because of its origins and connotations. You really shouldn't. You can't have it both ways.
uses the term parental alienation, that is the biggest red flag if I've ever seen one. But regardless what we call it, like I said, there are situations where an abuser will use triangulation or isolation of the child to drive distance between that child and their ex. And here are some of the tactics that they might use if that's the case. Bad-mouthing the other parent, saying that they don't love their child, hiding the child from the other parent, throwing out letters from the other parent, throwing out gifts from the other parent, withdrawing love if a child has a positive interaction with the other parent. You'll notice that some of these are actual manipulation strategies that people use, and then some of them are just like really poorly operationalized. For instance, forcing the child to reject the other parent. What exactly does that mean? How exactly does that look? How do we know that that's what's happening? Or like letting the child choose whether to visit, that doesn't seem like a manipulation technique to me. That just seems like giving the child a normal amount of autonomy about.
No, they have to follow the custody schedule. Just like you send a child to school, you have to send your child on the other parent's custodial time, period. Honestly, I'm not even going to finish watching that video because I can tell that it's not a fair representation of the issue at hand. And I was getting too worked up and it's not worth it. Not worth my emotional energy. So bye, Dr. Anna. I don't appreciate the way that you came at it. I don't appreciate the citations you did. And I think the issue is way more nuanced. I wish you had actually talked to somebody who'd been through this as a child. Reach out to me. I'll give you my perspective. It would be important to include. Sorry, guys. I don't usually get this worked up in videos. I should take a deep breath. Anyway, if you've come this far, thank you for watching. Hope you found it insightful or helpful in some way, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.